You're listening to Podcasting for Experts, with honest conversations about using podcasting as a tool to grow your reach, increase your audience, make a positive impact on the world, and most importantly, to get paid for your efforts. I'm your host, Jess, and we are Pristine Podcasts. Let's talk podcasting. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Season 2, Episode 4. In today's episode, I'm talking to Marie Gettel-Gilmartin, a writer and marketing communications coach and the host of the Finding Fertile Ground podcast. Marie is passionate about connecting people and resources and solving seemingly impossible problems. She helps you to discover what makes you special and how to share it with the world. In this episode, we discussed Marie's experience of living abroad in Japan, how that influenced her view on the world, how she transitioned into the work she's doing now, and what made her so passionate about our own stories, particularly those of resilience. And of course, we'll also talk about her journey to podcasting. I really hope you enjoy it. Hi, Marie. Thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat with me today about all things podcasting.
Thank you for having me.
You're very, very, very welcome. So I'm a bit nosy. I become like a little Sherlock Holmes. I want to know about who I'm talking to. And, I read a little bit about what people are about, I guess, and what's really important to them. And I always find it so interesting how everyone's stories very much leads to what they're doing today, and how it's never like a linear pathway that we're always told, like in school, like you do this, then you do that, and then you do that. And it's kind of not like that. And one of the things that I read about you was that you actually went to Japan for 3 years to teach English. And I really would love to know more about what that was like, because that's like a complete change of culture. And yeah, how did that feel?
Well, it was mind-blowing because I'd never been overseas before, because I'm American, and a lot of Americans, in contrast to Europe, people who don't have a lot of money in particular, my family didn't have a lot of money when I was growing up. So we traveled around the US a lot. We did a lot of camping and things like that. And my parents both had lived in Germany before I was born. They both taught English in Germany, and so I had that kind of seeded in my roots somehow, the living overseas idea. And so I got an English degree, and I decided I wanted to go live overseas. So I got the opportunity to be a teacher for a junior college in a town called Wakayama, which is about an hour away from Osaka. And I applied, and I did not know any Japanese. I was working as a nanny the summer before I went, and I thought, I'll just apply, and if I get it, I'll go. I meant to go. I'm kind of view life that way. And then I got the job. And then I fortunately convinced my college roommate, who was kind of taking a gap year after college, to go with me. Excuse me.
Nice.
Yes, thank God, because it would have been so much harder if she hadn't been with me. But and the really amazing thing that I just have to give kudos to my parents, because my parents said goodbye to me to go, fly off to Japan for a year. And this was back in 1986. So there was no internet.
Yeah.
there was no easy way to keep in touch with people. I mean, we had the postal service that was really, and then phone calls were very expensive back then.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they said goodbye to me. And the next week they put my sister on a plane to China, because she did a year abroad in China. And
that must have been so hard for them.
I know. And I think back to that, because I'm a mom of 3 now, and I think, oh my gosh, I can't imagine doing that. But anyway, it was a great experience. And I only intended to stay in Japan for a year, but I met my husband there. And so we met through a mutual friend, and he wanted to stay longer. And I knew he was the one for me. So I ended up really mostly staying there for 3 years because he really wanted to stay there. So it was a wonderful, wonderful adventure. We were able to travel throughout Asia. And a lot of Americans that I knew, because we generally have high college loans, and I had college loans. And some people were really smart and paid off their college loans when they worked in Japan, because the pay was pretty good. And I spent all my money on travel. And then I just paid my college loans off when I got back.
I think that would have been me. Like since since I've moved down here, there's so many places we've gone to for no reason whatsoever. And people are always like, why do you guys keep just going places? And I'm like, well, it's different. And I don't know. I grew up in Germany, but in the flattest of the flattest parts. And we don't have massive mountains just outside of the window. And we don't have anything like that. So I keep going places and... I don't know. It just feels so different to just look at the landscape and try foods and meet different people. And it's very, I can very well understand doing that as an experience.
Yes. And I remember the first day we arrived was kind of traumatic because the people we were working for were really, it was two men and they owned a company where they would find contract like English teachers to go work at various places, mostly this junior college that I was at. But they were not very honest and they were not very experienced as business owners. So my friend and I, it was a very difficult arrival in Japan. We knew no Japanese. We arrived at Narita Airport in Tokyo and we had to find our way to the Shinkansen, the bullet train to Osaka, without knowing any Japanese. So we had to take an airport limousine to get to the train station and then buy train tickets. And by the time we were able to figure it out somehow, I don't know how we did it, but by the time we got to the Shinkansen, there were no seats available on the train.
Nice.
So we had to sit. So we'd been traveling. We had cheap tickets. So it probably took us we had to go through Seoul to get to Japan because it was Korean Air. It was cheap. And so we'd been traveling for 20, 24 hours. So we had to sit between the cars with all of our luggage. I mean, we had 3 suitcases each. And for 3.5 hours to Osaka.
What I always think is thank God that happened when you were young, because now I'm I can't be asked find me a hotel or something. I am not doing this.
No, exactly. I was 21 years old. So you're right. Thank God I was young. And so then we arrive in Osaka and we call this guy, the guy who hired us, and said, what do we do now? He said, well, you have to go find a hotel. And we're like, there's no way we can find a hotel. So we basically insisted that they come to the train station. And, you probably know a little bit about Japanese culture. They had to get used to American women who were like, no, you have to come get us. So we insisted and they came and they got us a hotel. But it was not an easy start. So the next day they came and met us and we took the train to Wakayama. And Wakayama, the Japanese call it Inaka, which means the country, but it really was a small city. It was a beautiful city. And so I just remember arriving at our apartment. The first month we were packed together in an apartment with other English teachers before an apartment was available so we could move into a more spacious area. But I remember sitting in the tatami room and it was late August. So we could hear the sounds of frogs outside. There were rice paddies right outside the apartment. And it was just so overwhelming. It's oh my God, I'm in Japan. I just will never forget that feeling, So I can totally relate to you that I mean, travel is such a great discovery and I still love that. So
yeah, plenty. Yeah. I don't know, every time we go to the mountains here, people like to eat meat cooked, the whole day, and it tastes so good. But we would drive 3 hours south up into the mountains to go have lunch and then drive back for 3 hours just because it's so good and they know how to cook it properly. But it's just one of those things where people think you're crazy for doing that, but I just really enjoy it. And you're sitting there in between the trees and I don't know, there's something just very peaceful about the whole thing, sitting outside on the old wooden chairs, and I enjoy that. And I have those moments where I'm that's when I notice oh yeah, I am actually somewhere else. This is not what I'm used to. So.
It's so much more interesting. It stretches your mind and, your senses and all that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So how did you end up going from teaching to writing?
Yeah, so I started temping when I got back from Japan. I told my husband that I would support him for a year so he could write his big novel. He wanted to be a writer. Well, it turned out that I actually did that for 29 years. because I kind of realized that I like to work, and I'm a shy extrovert and he's an outgoing introvert. And so he actually was a stay-at-home dad when we had our kids. So it worked really well. I worked my way up the career ladder and was in the corporate world for 29 years. And I found myself, I was drawn to, leadership roles. I was in major leadership roles, and I reinvented myself over and over again in the corporate world. And then after 28 years in this particular company, and the way I first started in this company is I started out temping, and I was a temporary receptionist and admin assistant. And then I found out they had an editing department. So I applied to be in the editing department. And so that's where I became a writer, a technical writer and a proposal manager. And then I became a staff manager. And that's how I got my start, was really temping. So it was a great place to work. And it was an environmental consulting firm. So after 28 years, we got acquired by a really big engineering firm. And my specialty was sustainability and corporate citizenship, like social impact communications. And also, I was part of our corporate communications group, which had some toxic leadership. So after all that time, right after we got acquired, my position was eliminated. And so it was actually very generous. They gave me either 2 weeks to find another job in the company, or I could take my severance and go somewhere else. And so I had a decent severance, not compared to tech companies, but I probably had like 2 or 3 months, salary. So I knew that I didn't think I could stay in a company that would still employ these toxic leaders. So I left, and within a month, I found what I thought was my ideal job. And it was as a communications manager for a small company located here in Portland. And the first day on the job was horrible. And I stuck it out for a year. And there were some really positive things about that company and that year. But then a year later, I got my job eliminated again, got laid off again, or made redundant, as you say in Europe.
Yeah, whatever is the polite way for getting thrown out. Thanks.
Yes, exactly. And made redundant in many ways kind of says it more than got laid off,
Yeah,
So,
I guess.
So that was really devastating. But, nowadays when I look back on that, I feel like it was a real gift to me, because all the years that I was in corporate, I always thought, well, someday it would be really cool to open my own firm. And, I had that in the back of my head. And so after I got laid off, I was like, okay, this is it. This is what I'm meant to do. It took me a while to get there. I want to be completely honest about that, but I'm absolutely there. And I realized that that's what I was meant to do. So I am a writer and a marketing communications coach or consultant, and I love to help clients communicate clearly and painlessly. That's what I do for a living. And I founded this company called Fertile Ground Communications. And the reason I called it Fertile Ground was that I was looking for my own fertile ground in my career. So that name was really meaningful to me. So yeah, and I'm passionately committed to social justice and inclusion, and have really made it a priority to share stories of people who are historically excluded in the media and culture. So.
That's something that I found really interesting. So I agree about the name. Like when I saw that, I was like reading through the website, and then I thought, I love the way you've expressed this whole thing that every person has a story to tell that can really make them shine. And a lot of times, like, we can't see the story. I don't know if that's like a super thing, but if you asked me to tell people more about myself, I'd be like, oh yeah, and I did a little bit of this and a little bit of that and whatever. But, you'd kind of like brush it under the carpet. I would be like, oh, it's nothing, like minimizing the whole thing, the good things and the bad things, we can minimize like everything, I guess. So I thought that was very, very powerful, because if we're not able to tell our story, the world is not going to move ahead in any which way. We're not going to make any positive impact on anybody, because our story is, I guess, the thing that leads us to impacting other people. And that won't happen if we don't know how to share it, or if we don't feel confident to share it.
Absolutely.
Do you think it was when you were working and you were having this experience of having like the toxic leadership team and all these practices being employed and people being almost, like little victims in different places in the company? Somebody gets picked on and then they disappear and someone else gets picked on. Was it then that you started thinking more about inclusion and having people's voices heard more? Or is that something that comes from even before when you were abroad and you had a different experience and it really broadened your mindset to see that people can be vastly different, but still, just because it's different, it doesn't mean it's not any good? Is that something that was work or personal history?
I think it was personal history, really, with a combination of what I saw in the workplace too. So I was kind of born passionate about social justice, I think, and about people who are excluded. And then the other thing is my personal history. So I was born with birth defects. I had a cleft palate and a cleft lip. And so I got bullied a lot when I was in junior high. And so I think that it made me more attuned to other people and how they were feeling. So I think I've always been pretty sensitive to how other people are feeling. But I think over the years, as I've worked with a variety of people, and also I'm a voracious reader. So I've always been interested in reading stories about or by people who are in different cultures or who had different types of experiences and things like that. So yeah, I don't know. I think it was just the way I was wired partly, but then I become much more intentional about what my passion and what my kind of my legacy is, I think. I would call it a legacy, really. This is what I'm called to do right now, I think.
Yeah, I like that. I think it's something that so many of us are looking for. And I think we actually know the answers in our story. That's what I think. Like, it's our experience. And if we just, sometimes I don't want to open my eyes to that. I'm just like, oh, yeah, look at that another time. And it's like, I'll just put that over there a little bit. But yeah, I think that's really where the answer lies for so many of us. So seeing that the passion and the work was in, well, not necessarily in writing, actually. How did you think podcasting was the best method to use instead of, for example, writing articles to share people's stories or putting together a book or a gazillion different options that you would have literally to get the word out? Why podcasting out of all mediums?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's funny because a lot of people who are professional writers, they were like, oh, I started writing when I was a child. And I did write when I was a child, but I was sort of spotty. Like, I would start a diary or a journal and then I wouldn't stick with it very well. So I wrote a lot of letters. I was back, because I'm way older than you, back in the old days, we wrote a lot of letters. So I did a lot of that kind of writing. But I actually started blogging when 2002, maybe 2003, a long time ago. And so I would chronicle things, travels. I have a lot of stories on my blog about places I've traveled to. But also, as my kids were growing up, I would use the blog as a vehicle to kind of keep track of what was going on. I feel kind of bad because I have sort of been ignoring my personal blog and I kind of miss it. But anyway, I also would use it to spill out my thoughts about politics and things that are going on in the world. So when I started my business, I really was intentional about, I want to be able to say whatever the hell I want to say in my business and not have to worry about somebody else telling me like, oh, no, you can't say that,
Oh, yeah.
Because that was an issue, right? When you're in a big corporate world, you can't say something that might offend a client or, I was so tired of that. I was like, I want to be myself. I want to say whatever I want to say. So I started writing about communications. There's a lot on my professional blog about communications, but I also started writing about the workplace, like about toxic work environments and how to communicate better, more effectively. I don't remember exactly how much I wrote about race before George Floyd was murdered. But when George Floyd was murdered, on the same day that Amy Cooper was the woman in Central Park that called the police on Christian Cooper, no relation, for burning while Black. That happened on the same day in May 2020. And so I wrote an article about the weaponization of white women's tears. And I just kind of spilled out my guts, right? My anger and also my culpability as another white woman. There's a history in this country of white women manipulating the situation to their favor by crying. And that's what Amy Cooper did. So I wrote this article and it went kind of viral on LinkedIn. And my teenage son kept telling me like, Mom, because I was getting trolls on LinkedIn, these racist trolls.
Of course.
Yeah, who would look for articles about diversity and inclusion and, say horrible things. And my son was like, Mom, this is a good thing. So I was found by two people. One of them, her name is Jackie Capers Brown, and she's a podcaster and a business coach in Columbia, South Carolina. And the other one is named Charles Jackson, and he's a video podcaster in Tampa, Florida. So they both invited me on their shows to talk about this article. And when I had the conversation with Jackie, I found that even though she was interviewing me, I found through my conversations with her that she has been through a shit ton in her life. Like, she saw her mom die when she was 13 years old. She also lost a son when he was like 18 years old. So we also bonded over the song Rise Up by Andra Day, because she asked me about what's my favorite song. And I said, that's my favorite song. So it was all around the topic of resilience. And Jackie has this incredible resilience. So after being interviewed by those two, I thought, I've always been really inspired by stories of people who've been through a shit ton of their lives and who have become stronger because of it, because that's my story. I told you that I had, birth defects. I've also dealt with, like, my oldest son was born at just 24 weeks gestation, 1 pound, 6 ounces, tiny little thing. And so that was my first experience of motherhood. So he was in the NICU for 117 days. I also had a freak benign ear tumor thing in my 40s that caused me to have 4 surgeries, including one on my brain. So I have been through a lot in my life, right? And when I was a kid, I had all these surgeries. But my mom tells me that I was always really happy. I was a happy baby. I was a happy kid, even though I was going through all this awful stuff that no child should have to endure. So I'm just fascinated by, why are some people able to survive all this stuff and be resilient, and other people it just destroys. So I'm just fascinated by these people who are able to overcome so much. So that's why I decided to start a podcast, partly because the conversation with Jackie was really a good one. And I thought, I think this would be really interesting to do. So that's how I was drawn to it. And Jackie was sort of my mentor in podcasting too. She was very helpful as I was getting started. And so I have 2 podcasts. My first one's called Finding Fertile Ground, and it's stories of grit and resilience. And my first episode was a refugee from Burundi that I had met at an event I'd coordinated. And she left Burundi when she was 6 months old, and her family was in a refugee camp in Tanzania. She came to the US when she was 10 years. I mean, she has such a story. So I knew I wanted to start with Olive's story. So, and I know a lot of people who've been through a lot too. So I just made a list of all these people who have grit and resilient stories, and I started contacting them. So that's how I started.
I find this an interesting topic because I've also not had like the best whole bunch of a good few years. And it's kind of something that I had other people comment on it who are like, oh, I can't believe, after all that, you keep going. And I'm like, well, like, what else am I supposed to be doing? It's kind of the thing where I don't give up about anything. So my boyfriend always says, I'm kind of like, I'll bang my head against the wall until I find a spot that's like soft enough that I get through.
Oh my gosh. Well, it sounds like I need to interview you for my podcast.
Anytime, I'm up to it.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that I've actually just started season 2 of my podcast, and I've actually kind of switched it up a little bit, because before it was just stories of grit and resilience on a variety of topics. But now I'm really trying to focus on people who have found their fertile ground in their career or in what they're doing in life. So I think that your story would be a perfect one for that.
Yeah, totally up for it.
Yeah.
It's powerful to hear from people that manage to achieve despite anything and everything. And
Absolutely.
It's the thing where I'm like, oh, I see all the options and I see all the pathways, how it goes for people. And I find those pathways more interesting than anything else, because not everything always works out the way you think it does. So you have to go left, go right, and keep going in that general direction. And it just is what it is. And I think if you have the expectation that something is just going to go from there to there in a straight line, you're probably going to get disappointed, because it probably doesn't happen like that. So I'm like, okay, well, I hope it goes that way, but I'm not expecting it to go that way, because it probably, it won't. But
especially when you start your own business.
Well, yeah. So you said that you had some support in the form of someone who's already walked the path, which I think is very useful. How did you feel before the first episode went live?
Well, thinking back to when I was first interviewed by Jackie and Charles, I remember how nervous I was. I was so nervous. Oh my gosh. I think back on that. And I might get a little nervous, especially if I'm interviewing someone semi-famous. Like I've interviewed some authors and I was very nervous before those, but I was so nervous back then. And I also I was telling my husband this the other day, I never have liked my voice.
Oh yeah,
I've
same.
always been, that's typical, right? Most people don't like their voices. But one thing that podcasting has done for me is that I don't mind my voice now at all. In fact, I like it. It's really interesting because when you're editing podcasts, right, you listen to the podcast over and over again, right?
I can't do it.
Yes. Yeah, you do your own editing. Yeah, well, I do all my own editing. And so I've gotten used to my voice and I think it doesn't bother me now. So my first interview, I was excited. And I think it really helped because the first few people that I don't remember the first person I interviewed that I didn't actually know. The first few people that I interviewed, I at least knew a little bit. I didn't know incredibly well. Like my second interview was with a woman who is living with stage 4 breast cancer, Skye Liebold. That's probably my most popular episode, actually. So I didn't know her incredibly well, but we had served on a choir board together. So I knew her vaguely, right? And so that helped me a lot that I actually had met them in person. But with the pandemic, obviously, starting a podcast in a pandemic, it's actually been a gift because I've interviewed people, in other parts of the world. I've interviewed a few people in Italy, So whereas in the old days, I think a lot of podcasters were like in a studio and, it was before everybody had Zoom. And so now I'm much more relaxed about it, but I just remember how nervous I was. And I didn't, how they say often for podcasters, when you start a podcast, you should start with 3 episodes. My first podcast, I did not do that. I just started with 1. And I shared it a lot on social media. And yeah, I was excited about it, but I was nervous before doing the first interview.
I think I remember the first time I went live on Facebook. I was sweating. I was like, I'm going to press the button now. Like, now's the time. Yes. And then within 10 seconds, the bin lorry went outside my house and started collecting the trash. And I was like, oh my God, is that the moment?
Well, I would get more nervous. I get more nervous going live. I've taken some webinars about TikTok and things like that. Yeah. And I know that TikTok's supposed to be really good for promoting a podcast. And that's not live. Most of TikTok's not live, but I'm more comfortable with audio than video, I think. I still haven't gotten over that nervousness. And Facebook Live, I've done a few lives too, and that makes me more nervous. I think there's something about a podcast. It's first of all, it's audio. And second of all, I edit my podcast pretty heavily. So I really care about the product. So I want to make sure it's really high quality. Whereas Facebook Live, you're just winging it, right?
And whatever happens. That's like the thing. I'm like, exactly. I was like, there was someone collecting my rubbish. And I was like, I'm just going to wait a second. So I find the podcast also controllable. And I was saying the other day, I have way too many bad hair days to be doing YouTube on the regular because I just wake up and I look like my hand was like in the plug socket or something. I think everything is sticking up and I'm like, I'm not going to record myself looking like this. And I don't want to go and fix it. And I don't know. So I find the podcast is like the sweet medium because it doesn't matter how you look. You can still go and get the recording done. So definitely works for me. Hey, are you spending hours extra editing every other week because you forgot to do things like switching off your aircon or moving the dog outside of the house? Did you secure an amazing guest interview only to then forget to press record? Or maybe your guest forgot to press record and now you have to work with a really low quality backup recording? Do you want to batch your show and finally get ahead, but you can't for the life of you remember what's already done and what's not? Don't worry, this is really normal. There are way more steps involved in running a successful, high-quality podcast than meets the eye, and it's really easy to forget something here and there. But let's be realistic. If you really want to grow your show, you can't carry on like this. If you want to design a podcasting workflow that works, then grab our podcast workflow blueprint now. You'll get immediate access to our entire podcast workflow that we've been using with all of our clients for months. The blueprint contains a video training that explains exactly how our system works, the Trello board template that you can just plug into your account or transfer to your platform of choice, the the fully customizable template episode workflows, guest email swipes, and as a bonus, the guest booking automation video training. You can check it all out and get your copy at pristinepodcast.com/blueprint. And now back to the episode.
Yes.
Was there anything you were scared of? Was there any thought what if?
I don't think so. I don't think I was really scared. No, I can't think of anything.
Yeah, lots of people just said, what if someone, judges me, and what if someone from my work hears this, and those kind of things. But,
No. That's the freeing thing about having your own business, that I don't really give a shit anymore.
Yeah,
you know what I mean, right? I don't have to worry about that. And I've written pretty openly about toxic work environments and actually shared anecdotes without sharing names, So I love the freedom of being able to do that. And I'm not outing anyone specifically. I just am talking about toxicity. And so same with the podcast. I was nervous, I have to say, though, on my birthday last year, I did a podcast about my own story. And I was nervous about that one because I've talked pretty openly, I was sexually assaulted when I was 13. And I've talked pretty openly about that, over the course of the podcast. But I told that story, in that podcast. And that made me nervous because it was all me for the whole episode. So, But I don't think fear has been really part of my emotions. It's more nervousness. So,
yeah. I think nervousness is good, though. It's probably something you got to do.
Right. So. Yeah, and I've always, the irony of me is that I've always loved that quote, leap and the net will appear. But it wasn't until I had to start my own business, and now I look at it and say I got to start my own business. But until I was faced with that, that was really the first time in my life where I was in a situation that was not of my own making. When I went to Japan, I made that choice.
Yeah, you
right?
picked that, yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that is the same thing with podcasting. I think that you jump and you just have to trust that you're going to be fine. That's kind of, I guess I'm getting used to that, being a business owner. So not knowing,
always what's the worst thing that's going to happen? Okay, you start a podcast, no one listens.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
Guess what?
Exactly.
That's what happens to everybody, for the most part. You start a podcast and very few people listen to it. And that's okay,
Yes. Yes. And not knowing, from year to year, you don't, when you're a business owner, you don't know for sure how you're going to do the next year, right? You have to be willing to live with a little risk. And so, podcasting's like that too. And, it's funny because I'm on these podcasting groups on Facebook, and there are people who are braggarts. They go on and on about how many downloads they have. They're, they drive me crazy. And my podcasts are, they're not wildly successful. I would say that they're, according to what I've read, they are in the top 10% of podcasts, because a lot of podcasts just fizzle, right? They don't continue.
75% or something like that. So it's the most.
Exactly. Exactly. And what really makes my day is if somebody says to me, "Oh, I listened to your such and such podcast. That was really interesting." Because I don't always really know who's listening to my podcast, right? So that is what I live for. And if I inspire people, even if I inspire one person, I've done my job. So I try to be more focused on that than the downloads. But I started a new podcast in April, and it's just taken a little bit longer to take off. I think because it has a different audience. It's more about business. It's called Companies That Care. And so that's been a little bit slower to get going, but it's really interesting stuff. So I'm hoping that if I just keep with it, it'll catch traction.
I think it will. I found that you can say something one way and then you just say it a little bit differently next time, and suddenly you've hit the nail on the head with what resonates with the right person that you're looking for. And sometimes it just takes a little bit of time. I really like to work with expert-based businesses. I don't care what you're an expert in, but I feel like, when you know a lot about it, and then you ask the person a question and they go, so, and then they start, that's when I know I'm talking to somebody who's really passionate about it. And it could be anything. And it doesn't matter what it is that they do. I don't care if you're passionate about Star Wars. If you've got something to share and there's people there who are really interested in it as well, and you can form a community around it, I think that's amazing. And that's what this is so great for. And there's lots of people who have podcasts who just want to chat with their friends every Sunday for 1.5 hours and they record themselves. That's great, but that's not who I can help, because I don't know anything about that. I don't know how it works and I don't listen to it.
Right.
So
right.
I can't, if it works for you, that's amazing. But I can't offer you anything of value because I don't know anything about your audience. I don't know what the point is. So I'm not really sure about that. And that's taken me a while to figure out, through doing and through talking to people, that there's people who I really do not want to work with because we can't help them.
Right. Yeah.
So it's sometimes just in the choice of words and what you're talking about. And I think with time and with refining all of that, traction comes eventually through the consistency and through reaching more of the right people. And they share it with their friends and they share it with other people that they know might be interested. And over time, these things just grow. And yes, it might take a little bit longer. So what,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think if it's worth it, it's worth it.
Right.
So what would you think are some of the long-term goals, not just for the podcast, but as far as impact's concerned? Like if there's something that you could help to change, be the vehicle, the podcasts, or the actual work directly, in the form of consulting, what would be the change that you would like to see?
Well, I think that my two shows have different goals. My first show, my goal is to inspire people. That's my number one goal. And I also want people to feel like they're not alone because, I've interviewed a lot of people who've been through trauma and sexual assault or abusive childhoods or, recently I interviewed a guy who was, he's brought up in the Seventh-day Adventist church and he's gay, or he's bisexual, Black bisexual young man. So he shared a story and he had just been in an emotionally and some physically abusive relationship, his very first boyfriend. And it was just like
jackpot.
It was a shit show. Yeah, exactly. So, and a lot of people have this stereotypes about domestic violence and domestic abuse, that it's, that it's a domineering man and a submissive woman. Well, in this case, it was a same-sex relationship. So, things like that, my guests have gone through a lot. And so when people hear their stories, I want them to feel connected to my guests. And almost with the exception of the one interview, the one birthday story I did about myself, and then one little mini episode, all of my podcast episodes are interviews. So I want people to feel inspired, feel like they're not alone. And then for my second one, and then actually with my rebranding of my first podcast, I want people to feel like they don't have to be stuck in a dead-end job. That life is too short to be unhappy, working in a cubicle and, with people who you're not crazy about or working for a boss that you don't respect. Life's too short to be unhappy in your job. So I want people to get some hope out of stories of people who went on to do something different. And I've also found, this is really another conclusion I found with my podcast, is a lot of people have started their businesses based on their grit stories. So like I interviewed a widow who actually, was widowed at a very young age with 2 young children, and she created a business to help other widows. So that is just like, man. Or another woman who I interviewed on my Companies That Care podcast who had an eating disorder growing up. And she started a boutique that has a mission to make every person feel beautiful when they leave her shop. And she has a foundation that raises money for people who are going through eating disorder treatment. So I'm so inspired by these people that have taken their experiences and have created something like a business or a nonprofit out of that. It's just amazing. So that is, those are some of my goals. And for the other podcast, Companies That Care, I interview business leaders who are trying to make the world a better place for all. So whether that's in sustainability or social impact or philanthropy or something along those lines, or just being a caring company. And my goal for that is, again, to inspire people that capitalism does not have to be a selfish thing. It can be something that you can help other people with. You can create a company that actually has part of its mission to help people. So I want people to think about business in a different way. So those are my goals.
They're very interesting because obviously Albania here has been a communist country up until very recently, and the people are struggling. there's that, you must help others at all costs. Even if you yourself don't have anything to eat, you have to share. You can't make sure that you're looked after. And the companies are profiting from the, making as much money in the shortest period of time, despite what happens to the people. So it's very hard to see. And I believe that there can be a middle ground of sorts. And it is unfortunately going to be private businesses that will have to care. Here it's private businesses putting roads in villages because they have a company there and their trucks are breaking down. So they're putting down a road because the government is not going to put down a road. They're too busy stealing the money. So
oh my gosh,
it's so it is going to be businesses that have to care more than other people. And if they don't care either, then it's not going to be very pleasant long term. So it's going to take a while, I think, for people to experience change and to think beyond their own pocket.
That must be a real illuminating experience to live in a country like that right now while they're going through those growing pains.
Yeah, very interesting. Very sad to see sometimes, but, it's very frustrating, when I'm talking to people and they're like, oh, well, I'm just waiting for a man to come along and take me out of my parents' house. And I'm like, yep. I'm like, you could just move out yourself, right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Well, no, because, and I'm like, okay, yeah, sure. Like you're up against like a monstrosity that you can't fight by yourself. Like it's not gonna happen. But for sure, I was so blissfully ignorant before I came here. I thought everyone grew up with the same thing. I was in Germany. I went to the UK. I assumed everyone would have a similar experience, like completely blissfully ignorant. Mm-hmm. And then I'm here and I'm like, what do you mean you don't have hot water? Yeah. What do you mean you don't have any running water after 10 p.m.? Like, what do you mean? And I'm like, okay, right. Like things are really different. So learned so much and so much more needs to happen, but slow going for sure.
That's very eye-opening. I think it sounds like a developing country, really. I think traveling everybody should travel or live in a developing country at some point in their lives.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Countersign that, like I said, so ignorant. And then when people share, what it's really like, then I'm like, oh, I see. Right. Okay. Like very different. And then I can imagine what their experience is. And then you understand where their attitude comes from. And then you understand why they would fake their papers to get across the border. And then you understand why, and then you don't complain about that anymore. I'm like, I'm not making fun of people who are desperate or who get married for money. I stopped making fun of it because your situation can be really dire. And if that is a way that you can get out of it, go for it. Like just, you need to look after yourself. And here, no one's going to look after you. So you're going to do whatever you can.
Wow.
But it's very difficult to think, it's 2021 and that's the necessity that's out there. So lots of work needed, I guess, to facilitate some kind of change. So we've talked happily over our time as usual, as it's happened with every single interview. I will definitely go and change the timings that we plan in so that we can try and stick to it, because so many interesting people, so many interesting stories. I don't know if that happens to you when you're interviewing people and you're like, I want to know so many more things.
So, there have been a few that have, like, it was not my favorite necessarily.
Yeah.
And so they tend to be shorter. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's when you ask a question and the answer is, yes, I do.
Yeah. Or, actually I had this one interview maybe 2 or 3 episodes ago, and I went ahead and used it, but I was really on the fence. I asked her, because I always ask people in the beginning, tell me your childhood story. Because I'm really interested in how people get to be a certain way and what makes them tick. And I think, I was thinking it was her childhood story. It was even before I said, what's your grit and resilience story? She talked, I swear, for 9 minutes without stopping. So, and I think she had been on a lot of podcasts, and what she told me was all on her website. She had like a language that, kind of a narrative that she used for everything. And I did end up using it in the end, but it was not my favorite.
I think that's why I really struggled. So we do, podcast editing for clients alongside some other things. So we listen to a lot of podcasts.
Right.
And I've always found it interesting how sometimes it just doesn't materialize, or we've edited some where there was more filler words than there was words. So it's become very difficult to use, or we've had some where the person's just been doing like a sales pitch throughout the entire thing. Like every reply was a sales pitch.
Yes.
And I was like, I don't think I would want to publish that. So I'm like, I'm going to be very honest, because if I did an interview and then the person went, I don't want to publish that, thanks, I'd be like, so I'm like, I'm going to put a disclaimer there up front.
Yeah. I really like that disclaimer because I think I
want to be honest.
Use that for me. Yeah. And the other thing that I found, which as we both are learning things through podcasting, was that a lot of coaches love to be on podcasts, like life coaches, or whatever, some kind of coaches. They love that. And so they also tend to be the types who kind of use podcasts as their platform to advertise their services. And sometimes that can go on and on. And when I started my second podcast, I actually put on the sheet, whatever, the graphic of what I was looking for. I actually said, generally, I'm not interested in coaches. I'm kind of going that way because have you had that experience?
So I've worked online for about 6 years now. So I used to work in daycare back in the day, and I've had a bit of a change, but it's been 6 years now. And a lot of my clients were business coaches coaching business coaches who coach business coaches. And I did a lot of marketing and tech and still do for a good few hours a week. And it's kind of, unless I know that there's substance behind what the person is doing, I'm probably also not very interested.
Yeah.
Just because it's all the same, right? And I don't like people also teaching these icky. So a lot of the stuff that I talk about, like on Instagram, I'm like, right, like you mentioned earlier, launching with multiple episodes. Yeah, you can do that, but you also cannot do that. Yeah. Yes, it might blow up. Yes, it might not blow up. Yes, it might work for you if you already have a major audience. If you don't, it's not going to make a difference. You can launch with one and just not stress yourself out. Like, do you, and yes, you can do you smartly, or you can do you not knowing anything and you just fall over 17 times. If you have the, mojo to keep going, you will just keep going. That's your choice as well. I can give you, a heap of tips along the way of what I've seen may or may not make a difference. But in the end, if you don't feel comfortable, or if you don't have the time to batch record, 5 episodes, we'll start with one then, whatever. It's not in the long run, it's not going to make a difference.
Yeah. And I did with my second one, I did batch launch with 3. And I was just telling somebody the other day who's thinking about starting a podcast, like I saw no difference. Yep. I actually got more numbers with my first one than I did with my second one. I don't think it makes a difference. Just, this woman who, she does like, I think it's YouTube, like Monday motivational minute sort of things or messages. And so like, you should be doing a podcast. You should be putting that on a podcast. Like,
it's free real estate. You can just, extract the audio, export it, upload it as a podcast, and you're done. You don't have to do anything else. You've already created the content. I think that's one of the things I talk about a lot, is having one thing as that central piece of content, and then having everything else just be a regurgitation of whatever that central bit is. And if you can do video, then do video, because it gives you the most options for repurposing. But if you don't like video, then consider podcasting. And if speaking in general is not your thing, then write very good, very long, very optimized blog content. Like there's always an option. I don't even tell people, you have to be doing podcasting. No, you don't. If you don't like it, you don't have to do shit. Like, I don't like it. Fine, don't do it.
Right. It's not for everyone, I'm sure.
No.
And I think the other thing is you need to be really comfortable. I feel like the kind of podcasting I do, I feel like I need to really be vulnerable and authentic with my guests. To invite that from them, right?
It's a trust thing. It's like you put something out, they put something out, and that's how it happens for sure. And not everyone likes to do that.
No. No. And not everyone is suitable to be a podcast guest. I mean, I've told people, like, are you comfortable spilling your guts on audio? Because I ask some hard-hitting questions. I ask, people of color, I ask them about, when did they first experience racism? Or I ask immigrants about what did it feel like when you first came to the country for the first time, and not everybody wants to talk about those things. So
they're not easy times, but
I
think that's where the biggest learning experience is. Like, sometimes it's only after the bad things happen that I can see, I'm like, all right, I could see where that went wrong some time ago. I'm not going to do that another time, because now I know. And a lot of times I realize that while I'm explaining it to someone, and then I'm like, now that I'm saying it out loud, I'm just connecting this thing over here with that thing down there, and I should have seen that sooner. I'm like, good point.
Well, you sound like you have a lot of wisdom in your very young years, because you're pretty young.
Yes, I'm a sparkling 32. So
yes. No, you do seem to have a lot of wisdom. So
yeah, I don't know about that, but I have, sometimes you have wisdom when you think about it, or you look at other people's things. And then still in your own, in your own business, you're still like, yep, I'm going to fall over this one. I'm going to trip over here. I'm not going to listen to this person, although they've told me 5 times not to do that. It's like,
Right.
So a different kind of wisdom. So a question that I like to ask everyone, is there any tip that anyone's ever given to you that has ever become like a little mantra or something you can fall back to? Has anyone ever said anything that really resonated?
Well, I can think of 2 things, and you can use which one you want if you don't have time for both. The first thing was when I was in high school, I was on the speech team, and we used to go around to other high schools, or no, actually it was college campuses. They would have like a day-long speech and debate competition, and we would, give our speeches and compete. And my high school English teacher was the coach. And we were sitting around in like a university center during the competitions, like between the matches. And another student group had music blaring really loud. And I complained to her about it. I was like, oh, that group has their music so loud. And she said to me, Marie, there's no use complaining unless you're going to do something about it. And so that has always stuck with me, that like, yeah, if I have an opportunity to do something about it, I need to do something about it instead of just complaining. So that gave me kind of I can't say I always have the courage to confront something like that, but I think in that case, I probably just shut up. I stopped complaining, right? That's one thing that really has stuck with me. And then the other thing that is more on a professional basis was, I think I was 31 when I got a really big promotion at work. And I went from managing a very small publications group in my company to managing a 4 or 5 office multi-state publications group. So nice. It was a huge step up. And I was, struggling with, I felt like I needed to pitch for a raise because it didn't automatically come with a raise. So I needed to ask for a raise. And so I talked to a couple of male mentors of mine. And one of them said to me, Marie, you need to think like a man. And that was really helpful for me because, often as women, we undervalue what we can provide. Oh, yeah. And especially in the business world, you probably heard the statistic that women are only likely to interview for a job if we're like 100% qualified for it. And a man is likely to apply if they're like 50 or 60% qualified, Yeah. And there's that quote about, I wish I had the confidence of a mediocre white man.
Yeah, that's accurate. I was going to say, there's Denise Duffield Thomas did this talk some time ago about how men sell and how women sell.
Yeah.
So she was like, she's got this phone and she's like, okay, so I'm the man now. Here's this phone. It's $200. Do you want to buy it? Yes, thanks. Here's the money. Goodbye. And then she goes, and here's how women sell. I've got this phone, but it's really not very good, so I better not show it to you. Well, maybe if I lost another 30 pounds or so, then I could show you the phone. And, okay, here is the phone, but I'm not really sure. It should be 200 because that's what it cost me. But, would you give me 50 for it? Yeah. And it was so true. I'd never noticed how much we do that. And I have people ask me all sorts of questions because they're like, why do you change jobs every year and a half kind of thing? And I'm like, well, I was a nursery assistant, then I was a nursery nurse, then I was a room leader, then I was a deputy manager, and then I was a manager. There was no growth opportunity where I worked, so I went to get another job. Is that an unusual thing to be doing? I don't want to be doing the same thing for the next 10 years for no reason whatsoever. But that was weird. That was worth a question. Or I used to do tech, obviously. I had this guy tell me, he was like, well, I thought you were really very knowledgeable, but I couldn't have a woman in charge of our tech.
Oh my gosh, really?
I was like, no worries. I wish you the best of luck with your business.
Yeah, exactly.
Have a nice day.
Yes, exactly.
Thanks for dodging a bullet. Imagine if he'd taken me on and then I would have worked for him and then he would have complained every other day about some made up thing. But things like that where I'm like, did he just say that?
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay. So I just laughed about it. I was like, right, I better go find someone that's a bit more.
You dodged the bullet. Yes.
I'm like, thank you for telling me that.
Yes, exactly.
So I think it's really true that we've been put in a position where I think everyone's had so many experiences of being kind of excluded a little bit that it's easier to just not put yourself out there because you feel like, you're not really good enough. Although you might have the same results. I see that with business owners all the time, particularly the ones that run agencies. They get the same results that male counterparts get. But it's my Facebook feed is full of men going, hey, here are these amazing results I achieved. Do you want to come and hire me? And the women are like writing all this fluffy stuff. And I'm like, well, if you just did the same thing, I think it would work either way.
Right. We tend to use a lot more words because we feel like we need to. We need to explain ourselves more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I could rant about that for 2 hours, I guess.
That would be a good topic for a podcast.
That would be interesting.
Yeah.
So where can people find out more about you? Where can they find the podcast? Where can they reach you?
I have a website, www.fertilegroundcommunications.com. Everything's there. I'm on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and under Fertile Ground Communications.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'm easy to find.
I'll put everything also in the show notes for everyone so that it's easy to connect, because I think there'll be lots of people in the audience that would be very interested to listen and to find out more. So
yeah, and I have podcast tabs for both of my podcasts on my website with a list of all the episodes, and I usually write blog posts for each episode too, so with photos and stuff like that.
Awesome.
Being a communicator. So.
That's me. I'm like, I will talk another 3 hours. Oh, thank you so much for taking the time to do the interview. I really enjoy so many different podcasters talking about so many different things and all of them equally interesting. And I'm kind of like regretful that in all the however many years there are left for us to listen to each other's podcasts, there's not enough time.
I haven't thought about that.
No, but you know what? I think about that. So many interesting things. Like, I always used to say, how could you pick one career? Well, just do one thing. But this is interesting, and this is interesting, and this is interesting. And I'd like to know how to do that, and that, and that. Like, how could you just pick one thing?
Well, I have to say, that's the other thing about podcasting I love, is I have met more interesting people in the last 2 years than I have for years. I mean, fascinating people all over the world. And about 1 or 2 months ago, I met this woman who I felt like it was my soulmate. She's a Black woman who lives in Italy.
So that's a long way.
Just really, I know. And I found her on Huffington Post. And so I contacted her and said, could I interview? She had a really interesting grit and resilient story. And we really hit it off. You know, it's like things like that. Podcasting gives you an opportunity to meet these fascinating people who have incredible stories. So I love that about it.
Yeah, that definitely, I can vouch for that. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. I really enjoyed chatting about all of those topics that there isn't enough hours in the day to talk about. And I would love to talk again. I'm saying that to everybody. I would love to talk again, potentially, in a few months down the line as well, because I love to hear how their journey's developed and, if there's anything that has changed, that's really taken off, and how that's come about, because there's always a point where things start changing and start growing quite a lot. And I think it gives us a lot of perspective shifts. So I think I'll definitely reach out to everybody again to do some kind of follow-up and to see what's changed and what's new.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you so much for your time, Jess. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. All right, so that's it for the interview. I really hope that you enjoyed our chat. I know I did. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. So why not stop by over on Instagram? You can find us at Pristine Podcasts so that we can discuss the show together. You can go and find out more about Marie at fertilegroundcommunications.com, and you'll find all of her links in the episode show notes as well. That's it from me for this episode. If you enjoyed the show, our entire team would appreciate if you leave us a review. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast, or if you'd like to talk about collaborations, then please drop us an email. You'll also find the email address in the show notes. As always, I hope you have an amazing day, and we will see you for the next one. That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate you. If you're ready to step out of overwhelm, then don't forget to check out the podcast workflow blueprint at pristinepodcast.com/blueprint. The link is also in the show notes.